right. If you go through the press release and strip out all of the spin, we basically come down to these 12 elements or key components. Number 1, establish the diplomatic relations. Number 2 is adjust the regulations to empower Cubans. 3 is to facilitate the expansion of travel. 4 is facilitate money transfers to the Cubans by U.S. 5 is authorize expanded commercial sales. 6 is authorize Americans to import goods. 7, authorize facilitation of financial transactions. 8 is initiate efforts for access to communications. 9 is updating the status of Cuban sanctions in third countries. 10 is pursue multilateral discussions to resolve maritime border disputes. 11 is review Cuban designation of Cuban sponsor of terrorism terms. And 12 is pursue Cuban participation in the 2015 Summit of the Americas in Panama. Next, we'll try and go through each one of these slides and pick out the relevant parts to each of those. Within the initiate diplomatic relations category, the following provisions are provided for. First, the Secretary of State begins discussions to reestablish the diplomatic relations. And of course, in doing so, they have to reestablish an embassy in Havana, providing for high-level exchanges and visits. And they want to begin with U.S.-Cuba migration talks in January of 2015 in Havana. Next, they want to foster and improve human rights conditions and democratic reforms. And they also want to advance the U.S. national interests. Included within the U.S. national interests would be migration, counter-narcotics, environmental protection, and trafficking in persons. As we move on to the third item, which was adjust the regulations to empower the Cubans. First thing they want to do there is begin amending the regulations of the Treasury Department and the Department of Commerce. They want to alter the travel and remittance policies, and within those they want to promote alternate information sources, promote the opportunities for self-employment among Cubans, and promote private property ownership, promote the strengthening of independent civil society. The next thing they had in mind was to promote and enhance the people-to-people free flow of information to them, from the Cubans to us and among themselves, and they wanted mandatory compliance with provisions of the revised federal regulations of U.S. law. And I'm not sure just who that's supposed to entail, whether it's we Americans or they Cubans. But anyway, we'll find out when we see the final act. Well, as we move along, the next item was the facilitation of expansion of travel. General licenses for travel among the following 12 categories will be established. Okay, these are specific categories, and only those categories will be included. Family visits, U.S. government, foreign governments, and certain intergovernmental organizations, journalists, naturally, professional research and meetings, people attending educational activities, religious activities, public performances, clinics, workshops, athletics and other competitions and exhibits, support for the Cuban people, humanitarian projects, activities of private foundations, research or educational institutes, exportation, importation, or the transmission of information or information materials. Okay, that could probably cover a lot of the things like the internet-related activities. Consideration of certain export transactions under existing regulations and guidelines. God only knows what that means. Travel by any provider complying with the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the OFAC, and the facilitation of American opportunity for training for Cuban businesses and small farmers. Fifth item on the list was to facilitate remittances to Cubans by U.S. persons. Within that category, they want to raise the remittance levels from $500 to $2,000 per quarter for donations to Cuban nationals, with the exception of government officials or Communist Party members, donations for humanitarian projects, support for the development of private businesses, and specific licenses would no longer be required for those items. Also, remittance forwarders no longer require a specific license to perform their functions. Moving right along to the sixth item, it is authorization to expand exports of goods and services. The items authorized for export would include building materials for private residential construction, goods for private sector Cuban entrepreneurs, and agricultural equipment for small Cuban farmers. The next item on our list is an item which authorizes Americans to import goods. The new revision would say that licensed U.S. travelers may import from Cuba total goods worth $400. A maximum of $100 combined of tobacco and alcohol products are all that will be allowed from that total $400. Banks will get some consideration under the new policy. Correspondent accounts at Cuban institutions by U.S. institutions for authorized transactions. The regulatory term cash in advance will change to cash before transfer of title. I think this accounts for some of the consideration for the foreign involvement. U.S. credit and debit cards will be permitted by travelers to Cuba, so that's a big step to help them over there. The communication industry is one of the largest benefits of this new Cuba policy. The commercial export of communication devices will be permitted. That will include consumer communication devices, related software, the applications, hardware, and services. Telecommunication providers will be allowed to establish for the Internet communication mechanisms and infrastructure. Again, that's a very big help and will benefit the Cuban people greatly. As we move along, the next area is updating the application of Cuba sanctions in third countries. U.S.-owned or controlled entities in third countries will be generally licensed to provide the following services. They'll be able to engage in financial transactions with Cubans in third countries. It will allow for the unblocking of accounts of U.S. banks of Cuban nationals living in those third countries. It will allow persons to participate in third country professional meetings and conferences relating to Cuba. And it will also allow foreign vessels to enter the U.S. after engaging in humanitarian trade with Cuba. There are a few other details that need to be addressed. Specifically, we need to pursue discussions to resolve some maritime border disputes. Previous agreements between the United States and Cuba delimit the maritime space between the two countries within 200 nautical miles from shore. The United States, Cuba, and Mexico have extended the continental shelf in an area within the Gulf of Mexico where the three countries have not yet delimited any boundary. Lastly, we need to invite the governments of Cuba and Mexico to discuss shared maritime boundaries in the Gulf of Mexico. Those discussions can take quite some time, but they'll be fruitful in the long run. Another little detail that needs to be addressed is that Cuba is still designated as a sponsor of terrorism. The President has instructed the Secretary of State to immediately launch such a review and provide a report to the President within 6 months regarding Cuba's support for international terrorism. Cuba was placed on that list in 1982. And the last item in the policy was the inclusion of Cuba in the 2015 Summit of the Americas in Panama. President Obama feels very strongly that they should play a part in their destiny, and human rights is certainly something that they've been accused of some problems with over the past. So that's just about it on the contents of the policy. And lastly, I'd like to remind you that this presentation was extracted from the White House press release dated December 17, 2014. That press release is provided in its entirety on the backtobiz.com Cuban Policy HTML website. You can review it there, and we will be addressing some of the consequences of this policy in a further presentation.